welcome the 2016 presidential candidate, Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Well, let me thank Congresswoman Grisham for that warm introduction, and I also want to thank Congresswoman Linda Sanchez and Esther Aguilera and all of CHCI staff for hosting me here today, and thank all of you very much for being here. The reason I am running for president is that this country faces some enormously serious problems. One could argue that if you include the crisis regarding climate change, there are more serious problems today than at any time since the Great Depression. And I know that much of the media thinks of politics as how much money you raise, or what your standing is in the polls, or what kind of dumb thing you said last night. But all of you understand is in fact about the future of our country, what happens to tens and tens and tens of millions of people, many of whom are hurting today. And what I hope all of you understand, and I know you do, or you would not be here tonight, you would not be participating in the political process, is that if we do not bring people together, if we do not engage people in serious discussion, if we do not significantly increase the voter turnout, not good things will happen to our country. So what I ask of all of you is to engage in that debate, make sure that we have one of the highest voter turnouts in the world, not one of the lowest voter turnouts, and that we in fact start addressing some of the real problems facing our country. What I want to do today is touch on a few of those issues. And the first one I want to touch on is the need for real immigration reform. I also want to talk about the stain of racism, which has existed in this country and in the world for God knows how many years. And I want to talk about the economic reality which faces our country, and that is we have a middle class which for the last 40 years has been disappearing, and we have massive levels of income and wealth inequality that we have got to address. Now, as everybody here knows, that throughout history, for whatever reason, and I'm not a psychiatrist, we have lived with a stain of racism on all of human existence. Now, in my own case, I know a little bit about racism and what it means. My father lost much of his family in Europe as a result of the Holocaust. And he came to this country at the age of 17, not speaking a word of English. So I think the first point that we have to make is a commitment to end institutional racism in this country. And let me just say this for a moment, is there can be disagreements among honest people about immigration reform. I'm going to tell you in a moment what my view is. But what is not acceptable is demagoguery. What is not acceptable is attempting to define one group of people, quote unquote, as rapists and criminals. That is not the kind of debate and discussion we need in America today. That is racism, that is unacceptable, and that has got to be rejected. One of the great strengths of America, people around the world don't realize it, is in fact we are a nation of many, many people, of many colors, of many backgrounds, of many languages. And in my view, that makes us a stronger nation, not a weaker nation. This is something we should be proud of. My dad came from Poland. Many of your parents came from other countries. But when we stand together as a people and we bring our different cultures together, we create a nation of extraordinary capabilities which becomes stronger because of our diversity, something we should be proud of. As I mentioned, my father came from Poland without a nickel in his pocket, couldn't speak English, and he never made a whole lot of money. I grew up in a 3.5-room rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, New York. My mother's dream was that someday she would be able to own her own house. She died young, never achieved that dream. But my dad was the proudest American that you could ever see because he understood the extraordinary opportunities that this great country gave him and his family. And the fact that a very poor young man from Poland could see his 2 kids go to college was something of enormous consequence for our family. Today, as all of you know, we have 11 million people in this country who are undocumented, 99% of whom came to this country to improve their lives, to escape oppression, to flee desperate poverty and violence. And let us be frank about an issue we don't talk about enough, and that is that today's undocumented workers play an extraordinarily important role in our economy. Without these workers, it is likely that much of our agricultural system would collapse. A simple reality. Today, undocumented workers are doing the extremely difficult work of harvesting our crops, building our homes, cooking our meals, and caring for our children. In fact, they are part of the fabric of America. And let me just take a brief moment to tell you a little story about my experience with, one of my experiences with undocumented workers. Back in 2007, I learned about the horrendous exploitation in Immokalee, Florida. Anybody here from Florida? All right, you guys heard of Immokalee? It's near Naples. It turns out that in Immokalee, Florida, that is a town where a lot of the tomatoes are grown, low-grade tomatoes that are used in McDonald's and in Burger King. And the people who harvest those crops are by and large undocumented. On the day that I arrived, the day that I came to Immokalee, Florida, just coincidentally enough, the U.S. attorney was announcing an indictment of some contractors there who employed people who worked in the fields on the grounds of slavery. This is the year 2007. People were being held in involuntary servitude by some contractors there on the tomato fields. And in Immokalee, I saw the conditions and the exploitation that undocumented workers lived under. They worked very long and irregular hours for very low wages. Their housing was abysmal. And the reality of their lives and why they were able to be exploited was they could not stand up for their rights because they had no legal status. And that's the simple fact of it. Now, this story has a somewhat happy ending in that we were able to hold a hearing on this issue, and that was when the late Ted Kennedy was chairman of the committee, and he and I worked together. We had a hearing. We brought some people up there. And the end of it all is, through a lot of reasons, a lot of great people there doing good work, we ended up improving wages and working conditions. But today, 11 million people who are in this country, they remain undocumented and are having and struggling to adequately feed their families. They came to this country to escape gang violence and desperate economic conditions. Let me also be clear on raising an issue that is not talked about very much. And that is, when people come across the border, they know full well that there are employers who will hire them. And if anyone thinks that employers throughout this country do not know that the workers that they are hiring and in many cases exploiting are undocumented, then you don't know the history of America for the last 50 years. So where do we go from here? Well, I supported the 2013 comprehensive immigration reform legislation in the U.S. Senate. While it is a complicated piece of legislation, and it is a piece of legislation that can and must be improved, I believe that it provided a responsible path to citizenship so individuals could, in fact, come out of the shadows and people can walk the streets with safety. People can hold their heads high. People can have the protection of the law and participate fully and without fear in American society. And just to tell you a story, I was in Phoenix a couple of months ago, and after I spoke at a rally, a number of young Latino kids came up, and we chatted for a while. And there were tears coming down their eyes, coming down their cheeks, as they talked about their fear of being deported or of having their parents being deported. That is not the kind of existence, the kind of fear that we want millions of Americans, people living in this country, to experience. And that is why we must pass comprehensive immigration reform. Now, as many of you know, the Senate bill attempted to accomplish this important goal. And in my view, the time is long overdue for many of my Republican colleagues to end the demagoguery and, in fact, take up serious immigration reform. The Senate bill contained the provisions of the DREAM Act, which I strongly support. It is my belief that we should recognize the young men and women who comprise the Dreamers for what they are. They are American kids who deserve the right to be in the country they know as home. Now, that is not to say that I do not have significant criticisms of this long and very complicated piece of legislation. I believe the pathway to citizenship was unnecessarily linked to border security triggers, measures that many believe were put in place so that the path to citizenship would be delayed or even denied for the millions of undocumented individuals here, and I want to change those provisions. I also believe that the penalties and fines in the bill would be a bar, an impediment for low-income people, essentially preventing them from accessing the path to legal residency and eventual citizenship. To be meaningful, a pathway to citizenship needs to be achievable for the millions of workers at the lower end of the economic ladder. These and other barriers in the bill, including the time it takes, often more than a decade, that makes it a flawed piece of legislation which needs significant improvement. But in fairness, in a bipartisan way, at least the Senate did something. The time is very long overdue for the House to act. Now, until we can pass comprehensive immigration reform, and I hope that is sooner than later, we must be aggressive in pursuing policies that are humane and sensible and that keep families together. This includes taking measures that are currently available, including using the presidential power of executive order when it is appropriate. While the Senate passed the DREAM Act in its immigration bill, and while the House has not acted, I think President Obama did exactly the right thing through his executive order for deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA. DACA and deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents were good first steps, but should be, in my view, expanded. Deferred action should include the parents of Dreamers. We should be pursuing policies that unite families, not tear them apart. Obviously, the Latino community is deeply concerned about the immigration issue, deeply concerned about issues of racism. But like every other group in America, the Latino community, maybe more than most, is deeply concerned about the state of the American economic and political system. And let me take a few moments to touch upon that. The economic reality of America today is that, yes, we are doing better than we did 7 years ago when President Bush left office and when we were losing 800,000 jobs a month, when the financial system was on the verge of collapse, and we were running up the largest deficit in American history. We are better off today than we were then. But, and here is the big but, what we should also recognize is that for the last 40 years, the great middle class of this country, once the envy of the entire world, has been disappearing. And that has accelerated since the Wall Street crash of 2008. And while millions of Americans today are working longer hours for lower wages, and while youth unemployment is outrageously high, And while young people cannot afford to go to college, and while we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, there is another economic reality that is taking place which needs a lot of discussion. And that is that the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations are doing phenomenally well, and almost all of the new income and wealth being created are going to the top 1%. Now that's a fact, and I know that people get uneasy and uncomfortable about talking about it, but it is an issue that has to be put on the table, because we need to create an economy that works for all of us, works for seniors, works for the children, works for working families, and not just an economy that works for the top 1%. At a time when millions of Americans are working 2 or 3 jobs to bring in enough income and health care to take care of their families, it is not acceptable that Latinos make up more than 16% of our population, but have only 2.2% of the nation's wealth. It is not acceptable that youth unemployment in this country has reached tragic proportions. And I want to say a word on that, because this is an issue that is too rarely discussed. A couple of months ago, I asked some economists to do a study for me. And the study is, tell me what the real rate of youth unemployment and underemployment in America is. And this is what they reported back. If you are a high school graduate, not a dropout, a high school graduate between the ages of 17 and 20, if you are white, real unemployment is 33%. If you are Hispanic, real unemployment is 36%. If you are African American, real unemployment is 51%. Now, what this means is that we have millions of young people in this country, people who want to leave their homes, start a career, make some money, become independent, become adults, and yet they have no jobs and they have no education. And if anybody in this room thinks that it is a coincidence that when we have 5.5 million young people who are not in school and are not working, while at the same time we have more people in jail than any other country on earth, if you think that's a coincidence, you would be sorely mistaken. In my view, it makes a lot more sense to invest in education, invest in jobs, rather than in jails and incarceration. This is a huge issue. And by the way, I want to applaud the president for just yesterday announcing that thousands of people in jail for nonviolent crime will be released. And that is exactly the right thing to do. Together, we must end this dubious distinction of the United States having more people in jail than any other country, and we must move to the distinction of having the best educated population on earth. And as part of that whole issue of criminal justice reform, a huge issue, I have introduced legislation to eliminate privately run jails and immigration detention centers. And by the way, when you do that, you're ending the quota for detaining undocumented immigrants. Corporations should not be making profits on the incarceration of people in this country. But when we talk about our economy and where it is today, it is, first of all, the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality. Today in America, the top 1/10% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Got that? Top 1/10% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Today in America, with people working incredibly long hours, people working 50, 60 hours a week, 58% of all new income is going to the top 1%. In the last 2 years in America, the 14 wealthiest people in this country saw their wealth increase by $156 billion. That wealth increase in 2 years is more wealth than is owned by the bottom 130 million Americans. Wow is the right response. But it's more than wow. It is immoral, it is unsustainable, and we have got to change that. Essentially, what we have now is a rigged economy which says, heads they win, tails you lose. And we need an economy, and we can build an economy which works for the middle class, and that is exactly what together we have got to do. But when we talk about the economy, it is not just the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality that has to change. It is also the reality that if you have millions of people working 2 or 3 jobs, and let me tell you a story here. I was in Des Moines, Iowa a few months ago, and I talked to a guy who works for a church group at a farmer's market. And what he was doing is collecting the food that was not sold and taking it to an emergency food shelter. And I asked them, you know, what percentage of the folks who go to that emergency food shelf are working? And you know what his answer was? 90%. In other words, in Des Moines and all over this country, you got millions of people who are working really, really hard, but they're not earning enough money to adequately feed their kids. At the root cause of that problem is that we have a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Now, you could do the arithmetic as well as I can. Multiply 7 1/4 by 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and what you will find is that wage is totally inadequate for anybody to survive with a shred of dignity. In my view, when you have a minimum wage, which is a starvation wage, we have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. That is $15 an hour over the next few years. And by the way, while everybody in this country, all low-income workers, would benefit, nearly 60% of Latino workers would get a raise under this proposal. When we talk about the future of our country, we also have got to recognize that we live in a highly competitive global economy. And if we are going to do well now and in the future, we need to have the best educated workforce that we can. And in that regard, it makes no sense to me that today we have hundreds of thousands of bright young people who have done well in school, who are qualified to go to college, but cannot go to college for one reason and one reason alone. And that is their families lack the money. That is absurd for two reasons. First of all, it is terribly unfair to those young people to say to them, you're probably never going to make it into the middle class. You're not going to become an engineer, a doctor, a scientist, a teacher, or whatever. You're not going to do that because your family lacks the money to get you a higher education. But it is also absurd for our country, which needs the best to develop the best intellectual capital that we can. And that is why I have introduced legislation and would fight to make happen as president that every public college and university in this country be tuition free. And the reason why that is a big deal is obviously it will help so many working class and middle class and lower income families, but it does something else. It tells children in the 4th grade or the 6th grade not to give up, to pay attention to their schoolwork, to do their homework. Because what it says is that any child in America, regardless of his or her income, will in fact be able to get a higher education, and that is a big deal. There is another issue which is of enormous consequence to this country and touches on every other issue. And that is the fact that as a result of the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, our campaign finance system has become corrupt, and I use that word advisedly, and American democracy is being undermined. It is not acceptable to me that we have a campaign finance system which today allows millionaires and billionaires to contribute as much money as they want into the political process in order to elect candidates whose job in life will be to represent the wealthy and the powerful. When you have one family, the Koch brothers, worth some $85 billion, when this one extreme right-wing family will be spending some $900 million in this campaign cycle, which is more money than either the Democratic or Republican Party will be spending. When you have one family outspending either of the major political parties in this country, my friends, you're not talking about democracy, you are talking about oligarchy, and that has got to change. And when we talk about election reform, I trust that all of you know, and I don't mean to be overtly partisan here, but I have to be, that in this country today, in Republican states, one state after another, there is a very concerted effort to suppress the vote, to make it harder and harder for people of color, for low-income people, for older people, for students to participate in the political process. And they do this under the guise of trying to protect their states from voter fraud. Voter fraud is a very serious issue. Fortunately, it hardly exists in America. And everybody knows what the intention is of those voter suppression efforts. What Republican governors and legislatures are saying is, we don't want a fair election. We want to do everything that we can to prevent people whose views are different than ours to participate in the political process. Now, I've run for office many, many times in the state of Vermont. Often I've won, sometimes I've lost. But it has never occurred to me to figure out a way to deny people who disagree with me the right to vote. So what we need is federal legislation that makes it clear and straightforward that any person in this country who is 18 years of age has the right to vote. Discussion ended. When we talk about where we need to go as a nation, we have a lot to be proud of in America, but that we have also some very serious problems. Let me give you a few examples. The United States of America today is the only major country on earth, the only one, that does not guarantee paid family and medical leave. Now, what that means is there are women today who are giving birth. If those moms and that family have sufficient income, mom and maybe dad will be able to stay home with the baby, get to love the baby, know the baby, nurture the baby in a way that babies deserve. But if that mother is low income or working class, the likelihood is that 1 week or 2 weeks after she gives birth, she will have to go back to work in order to earn income to take care of her family. Now, you hear a whole lot in this country about family values. Separating a mother from a newborn baby because she lacks the income to stay home is not a family value. It is the opposite of a family value. Now, in my view, we have made progress in this country against tremendous ideological opposition in increasing the number of people who have health insurance, and we did that through the Affordable Care Act. And we should be proud of what we have accomplished. Those of you who are young or under 26 can stay on your parents' insurance policy. If some of you or your parents have pre-existing conditions, we have ended the obscenity of insurance companies saying, oh, you have cancer, you had cancer 5 years ago, we're not going to insure you for cancer. We have ended that obscenity. And we have also provided insurance for some 15 million Americans who previously lacked health insurance. All of that is very significant. But what we have not done, and I hope all of you know that, is we have not ended the embarrassment of being the only major country on earth, the only one, that does not guarantee health care to all people as a right. And today we have 29 million people who have zero health insurance and many more who are underinsured with high premiums and high deductibles. So count me in as somebody who believes that health care is a right, not a privilege, and that we should move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program. All right, let me conclude my remarks by asking two favors of you, not for me, but for our country. Number one, when folks tell you, when your friends tell you, why are you wasting your time going to meetings where they're discussing all these boring issues like immigration or jobs or health care? or climate change, why are you wasting your time when you could be out partying? You tell them that when the second wealthiest family in this country is spending $900 million on this campaign, you tell them that politics is, in fact, very important. And who is elected president, who controls the U.S. House, who controls the Senate, who controls governor's chairs all over this country is of enormous consequence to their lives, to their parents' lives, and to their children's lives. So my first request of you is do everything that you can to engage people to get involved in the political process. We had an election last November. 63% of the American people did not vote. 80% of young people did not vote. So when ordinary people, by the tens of millions, do not vote, trust me, that void is filled by very wealthy and powerful special interests. Big campaign donors who absolutely do not want you to vote. They want you to think that politics is a joke, not worth your time. They think it's important so that we can give tax breaks to billionaires and millionaires, so that we can have trade policies which shut down plants in America and move abroad. They think politics is very important. But if you think that it's important that we create millions of decent-paying jobs in this country, that we provide health care to all of our people, that we address the planetary crisis of climate change, that we end sexism and racism in this country, if you think those issues are important, then you better get involved very deeply in the political process, because we need you. And the second point I want to make to you is that you live today in the wealthiest country in the history of the world today. America is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And that means that we all have got to think big, not small. Please do not get caught up in these debates that take place here on Capitol Hill about whether we cut education by 2% or whether we raise it by 1%. That's thinking small. What I want you to ask yourselves is, why is it that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth? Why is that? Why is it that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, we're the only major country doesn't guarantee health care to all people as a right, or has paid family and medical leave? Why are we the only country? Why are we the country on earth, major country, that has more income and wealth disparity than any other major country? Why is it that in Germany and many other countries, their young people can go to college and graduate school and medical school tuition free, while in America, hundreds of thousands of families cannot afford to send their kids to college, while others, by the millions, graduate school deeply, deeply in debt? Why is that? And in my view, when we think about these issues, it comes down to the reality that we have a small number of people, people I call the billionaire class, whose greed has no end. They want it all. They want all of the economic benefits of our society. They want to control the political life of our society. And make no mistake, these people are enormously, enormously powerful. They fund politicians of both political parties. They control much of our media. In my view, the future of America, and whether or not we have an economy that works for all of us rather than just the top 1%, is to bring about what I call a political revolution. And what that means essentially is that all of us become engaged in the political process, that all of us demand that the next President of the United States and Congress start representing the vast majority of our people and not just the wealthiest people in this country. So with that, I would love to welcome many of you to the political revolution, and thank you all very much for hearing me out. Thank you.